Thank you very much. I'm very delighted, very happy to be with you today, and very happy that this forum that we prepared for a long time is finally happening. I will just very briefly describe myself, as we have a crowd online. We might have participants with visual impairments. So I'm a white man in my mid-40s. I have brain hair, I have facial hair, and I'm wearing glasses to read this speech. Just to let you know that this 2023 edition of the Cultural Mobility Forum is dedicated to environmental sustainability, and it's taking place in Tunis. And these two information will guide us through the entire program. But we need to address the elephant in the room. And I will start by addressing the first element, the first elephant in the room. We will be talking in English in a country that is not English speaking. And we are not, all of us, English natives, obviously. Some reaction to that. But considering that the event is live streamed and hundreds of participants from across the world, literally from across the world, are watching and viewing this forum online, we decided to go for English or Globish, acknowledging that we don't master English and we trust you and one another to be able to find the right words, to reformulate whenever it's needed to make sure that we understand each other. We believe that a diversity of languages are good, necessary, and we should fight for it. And at On The Move, we try as much as possible to publish our publications in several languages. And ahead of this particular forum, we published a cultural mobility yearbook that will also quote several times during these 2 days, that was also partially published in Arabic, and a cultural mobility funding guide that was also entirely published in Arabic. So we don't disregard the diversity of languages. And we have a second elephant in the room. And this is an elephant that is quite familiar. It's the visa elephant. Each time we organize a cultural mobility forum or have cross-border mobility discussions, we unfortunately have to address this elephant. When organizing this international event, we ourselves came through a lot of complexities, navigating rejections and complications. And just to give you a couple of examples, we had our members from Taiwan, the Taiwan Art Space Alliance, that decided not to come because of the hassle to be asking for a visa to be able to come here in Tunisia. We had one workshop participant, I don't want to name names, but Marwa Elmi, the former director of the British Council Egypt and expert at UNESCO, who had to wait until the very, very last minute to be able to get a visa and board on a plane to this country. We had 2 representatives of the Ukrainian cultural foundations, Irina and Anastasia, who were asked to go to Russia to be able to get a visa, which of course they didn't do. So let's be honest here. Visa is not the issue and is not the topic of this forum, but visa are a constant conversation. I trust that we will focus on our main topic, environmental sustainability, but of course, these topics will be emerging throughout our conversations because it refers to a lot of realities of the people in the room and the people watching online. I want to salute here On The Move members, in particular the mobility info points that are key players to be able to support all these administrative burden from visa issues, double taxation, work permits, It is a very active group of organizations that dedicated time and effort to provide information and support for free. So we need to salute their effort and hope that they will continue, but also many more organizations will continue to deliver such advice and support. I trust that, particularly tomorrow morning, we will have a conversation about South-South mobility, but also sustainable transcontinental cultural relations that will gather Sana Oustati, Gita Kaldi, and François Boudard. And in this conversation, probably the visa issue will re-emerge. But this year, Cultural Mobility Forum is dedicated to the tensions between international mobility and climate emergency. Our goal is to put this green transition conversation in perspective by looking at how this notion is approached, envisioned, practiced, informed, and context-based to allow different forms of green transition to exist. On the Move thus proposes a framework to listen and interact with a variety of voices from Africa and the Swana region through 4 thematic panels. And I want to thank already Leila Ben Qassem that feedbacked on the way the questions were framed and how the topics were approached, and that agreed to be the rapporteur of this forum and share her insights and takeaways at the end of each day. In recent years, as you are fully aware, the cultural field has been increasingly focused on climate action, climate change, trying various ways to tackle the urgent need to develop more environmentally sustainable practices in our own ecosystem. To quote Yamam Al-Zabaidi from last year's Cultural Mobility Forum in Helsinki, the arts and culture field is a laboratory for contemporary societies. It advocates for a more sustainable world in the most broadest sense possible. So this forum is an attempt to recontextualize this conversation on cross-border mobility and climate emergency, unfolding interdependencies between privileged Western countries and other territories, but also unfolding the many initiatives that raise awareness through new artistic work, adopt new ecological processes, productions, to measure and reduce carbon emissions of cultural venues, prioritizing slower and more meaningful international mobility experiences. Our sector has embarked on a long journey, full of paradoxes, full of contradictions, and we are here to unpack them, but also to try to pave the way towards a brighter future, if possible. Let's stay positive, and this is also what I would like us to do today and tomorrow. Let's try as much as possible to be positive. So we have this morning 2 panel discussions. We will have a panel discussion on greening policies and support schemes, where I will be asking many questions to Karim Sultan from the Kamel Lazar Foundation and to Arij Abou Arb from Amelred Cultural Resource. We have seen and witnessed and act at international European level, and many support schemes, task force, organization, our mission to work on reducing the carbon footprint and addressing all the climate emergency related challenge. Many countries develop ecological strategies, and public and private funders, cultural players are invited to revisit their priorities and to develop new ways to operate, but also new ways to support. So in this panel, we will be talking very much about who can afford sustainability, to quote the wonderful Nick Jonah from the Pan-African Creative Exchange. So who makes the decisions, who enforces certain conditions, who benefits from this reorganized ecological greener world, and who might be left out. But we will start the day by talking about the arts, because it's always good and it feels right that a cultural mobility forum that focuses on arts and cultural mobility to start by the arts. So in this first panel, and I'm asking now both Selim and Ukona to join me on stage. In this first panel, we will be discussing how we can work toward a more ecological artistic production and distribution. Thank you. Thank you both for joining me. So this panel, I'm very happy to have you both on stage. Not only because you are great professionals and persons, but also because you both contributed to the Cultural Mobility Yearbook that On the Move has published ahead of the forum. And in this Cultural Mobility Yearbook, we had our wonderful team member, John Ellingworth, making a wonderful data analysis of the hundreds of calls that On the Move publishes and delve into this particular focus on environmental sustainability. But we also commissioned these two persons to write a text about their take on this issue of environmental sustainability. I'm going to present you both with a little bit more details. I feel you deserve to be presented and credited for the remarkable texts that you published and that were a true inspiration for the design of the entire forum. So Ukona Mlandu, you are the director of Great Moor Studios in Cape Town, and you are founder and head curator of Makwande Republic. You've been a curator of many festivals and active not only as a curator but also as a, I would say, theoretician, writing, reflecting a lot on power dynamics, gender issues, mobility justice, as mobility is also very close to your heart. And next to me, on the other side of the stage, I have Selim Ben Safia. Selim has created, founded, and is leading an organization based in Tunis called Badil, Cultural Alternative, which I like it very much. And as a dance artist, choreographer, he has delivered many artistic projects, but also has been appointed last year the artistic director of Les Journées Chorégraphiques de Carthage, the international dance festival of Carthage here in Tunisia. But he also worked and developed two interesting projects, I feel, for this conversation. One is called Archipel, and we will delve into that, and the other one is Orly. So welcome you both. Thank you for accepting this invitation. And I will start this conversation by throwing at you a question or a remark that we hear a lot in reports, publications, comments that we hear about the ecological transition or the green action, is that the arts have a particular role or a particular power to address the climate emergency or to be able to raise awareness of new ways to make art, distribute art. For the preparation of this forum, we delve into many reports, recent publications that was made in 2020, 21, 22, and until very recently at the beginning of the year. And it feels like many reports and publications recognize this power. So I wanted to hear from you both how this resonates, actually, this power of the arts.
Okay, I can go first. But before I go, good morning, everyone. I just want to invoke Zainab Farad's name one more time. I've never met this person, but as soon as I walked into the space, I certainly felt a powerful presence. which reduced me to come and sit here quietly by myself instead of socializing with everyone, until Fanny and I were reintroducing ourselves. And then she said, I have to show you this picture. And then it made sense to me what it is that I was feeling. So Zainab Farad, we see you and thank you for your work. Yeah. What do I think of this? I think it's quite cute and convenient, the ways in which the world invoke this power that the arts has in moments where they may be absconding for taking responsibility for their own kind of action or inaction on particular topics that kind of organize the world order. And so suddenly we recognize this particular power that the arts has to play a role in a particular thing. So I start from there, and then I go, but at the same time, the reason why I've dedicated my life's work to this industry is precisely because I myself recognize this power. And you know, power can both be constructive and subjugating, and so then I begin to grapple with what we mean when we make this what's the English word, when we kind of bestow this power in considering how the world negotiates power and the world's relationship with power. When people speak to the power of the arts and the role that it has to play, which of these powers are they referring to? Are they referring to a subjugating, dominant kind of power, or are they beginning to lean into the possibilities of a power that is more constructive, that is more collaborative, that is more, and if so, how do we back that up with the resources to enable the people that we are handing over this power to be able to use this power in ways that are constructive? So that's my initial thought.
Yeah, that's a wonderful thought. Thank you for sharing. Selim, on the same question, on the power of the arts to address ecological, environmental issues.
I'm aligned with Yohann. I think as citizens, and we are all have impact on this subject, and we all have a role on this subject. And as an artist, I think when we create a performance or a show, one of our aim is to have impact on different subjects. And I think if we are involved in this question of green mobility and environmental question, we have this power to have an awareness to this subject and to have an impact. But also I think we, of course, have a big power, but we don't have to make a big light on this power and say the artists have to speak of this subject. I think we have, as an artist, we have to be free and to speak about a subject, different subject they impact us. And I think as an artist, if we have the sensation we need to speak about the green mobility, yeah, we have a power to impact.
The artistic production, how they could recycle some sets, how they could try as much as possible to manipulate and use many tools that start to be available. And I wanted to ask you, from your own perspective and context, how this both narrative and journey looks like. Does that resonate? Do you witness the same attempt to try to adopt new ways to create, produce, and distribute artistic work? Should we start again with you, Ukona?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I kind of problematize the idea that we are starting to think of ways that speak to the notions of a more sustainable way of working. Because it has, just because it's the language of the day, and people who sit in specific areas of the globe are beginning to embrace this concept in particular ways, it doesn't mean that this is the beginning of people working and living in ways that speak to environmental sustainability. So that's the first point. As long as like it's not another classic case of somebody discovering a part of the world where people have always existed. So that's one. So the second thing is that so if we take that into consideration, then we must understand that, like, whatever we understand to be the environmental crisis or the environmental sustainability conversation, we must know that there are a lot of stages happening all at once, and I allude to this in the article that I write, is that the crisis is imminent, it is in progress, it's looming, and it's in its regenerative stage all at once. And I mean, I don't want to be long about this, but just to make an example, like, it's regenerative because nature will find ways to fight back, but also to not be passive in this conversation, right? It's happening because there are countries in the world, populations in the world, who are living the devastation of some unsustainable environmental practices. It's looming because if we don't change certain things, we can sort of project what the consequences are. So all of these things are true at once. So I'm not able to really engage in an exercise where I now must demonstrate in particular ways the ways in which artists in Africa have been working in ways that are environmentally sustainable. I'm more interested in a conversation that looks at it and goes, so what is the conversation around environmental justice as opposed to sustainability? Because the sustainability conversation, for me, it leans too much towards wanting to save the flowers and the trees and the oceans at the expense of some of the most vulnerable people who already have been working in particular ways. So I'll stop there for now, right?
You can continue. I can listen to you for hours. But this is interesting also because it reflects in the article that you published in this Cultural Mobility Yearbook.
Sorry, just one more thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say, if I were to clarify, like, I can't stand here and tell you how, like, most artists from Africa already use materials. Like, it's not a thing that, it's not a performance that I'm willing to do on behalf of anyone and towards anything, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is also in this text why you are questioning the we. Like, we need to go sustainable, we need to go green, but who is this we referring to? And in a way you are already distinguishing different categories of countries, populations, making a clear point that some privileged context may actually adopt new ways to produce and change practices when others are in a vulnerable position. and don't have exactly the same choices to make. So who is this we that we are talking about? Selim, who is this we that we are talking about?
I don't know. I think when we speak about how we can produce, etc., and how we can create more ecological performance, etc., I think we are all aligned with this. I think we are all in the same world and with the same catastrophe we are living of ecological sense. But I think it's important to make context on this, because I think we don't have to have one rules about how we can create more ecological performance. And we cannot, it's the European Day, but we cannot have rules from Europe to say, this is the way to create ecological performance, this is the way to move on green mobility to perform. I think we have a context, and we have to keep in this context, because what is really in Europe can be applicable here in Africa, and or in Tunisia or in Morocco, etc. So I think we have to have in mind this ecological issue, of course, but we have to also to be free to manage this ecological issue as we can and as we want, and with the possibility we have in our reality. And I think this point is really important, because we can have sometimes the rhythm when we work. As you said before the beginning, we have the French rhythm or the European rhythm, and we have also our rhythm and our way of thinking and our way of working. And I think it's important to give each country, each territory, the freedom to make it like we can and like we want.
And it is interesting also that you touch upon this necessary translation or contextualization of whatever green conversation we might have, and how decisions at local level can actually be sustainable, but not because of the sake of sustainability or green sustainability, but because it is the way the structures are in place, and you navigate local structures or lack of local structures. We have a very interesting examples with Orly, the festival that you created, and that actually embrace a sustainable dimension, but for, I would say, side reasons. I mean, if you can just present it a little bit.
Yeah, so Orly is in the airport. Orly is on two words, Orly, and it means out of the bed. And we created this festival in Tunisia in 2014. And the idea was to how we can perform on all the city of Tunisia, and on the city where there is not theater, where there is not technical equipment to involve the performance. So we say, okay, we don't have maybe a big theater, or we don't have the theater at all, but we have house. And in Paris we say, I live in a big 20 meter carré, and in Tunisia, big and 20 meter carré in the same senses is not make sense. So we said you have a big house and you can perform in this house. So why not we can have a tape and to create a path in a city which the audience can move from a house to another, to see a dance performance in a rooftop, to see music performance in the kitchen, and to see theater performance in a bathroom. And the idea is to create also local performance to people who do not have access, and also to create this local path, and you can move from a performance to another walking, and we can also move from a city to another with local transport. And for me it's really important to create by the community for the community. So we create the early path with a local artist or Tunisian artist for the Tunisian people and for the local people. And the festival is free. And to create this festival, we also involve young people from the society civil, and we involve these people to create impact on their country, and I think it's really important to involve them to create this kind of festival.
But it is interesting, we go back to this idea of impact, commitment and impact. And both of you started to talk about or touch upon interesting themes and ideas that we could delve into. The first is the cultural impact, opposite the carbon footprint impact. So the idea of trying to develop a new lens to look at a cultural impact on an artistic community, but also like a broader community. And you introduce the term justice, that for me refers not only to environmental justice, but at some point to mobility justice, which is also an idea or fight that starts to make a voice. My God, my English is so tired today. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I mean, you understand.
Yeah.
The idea of having a mobility justice high in the agenda. In both these, having in mind this conversation about artistic production and artistic distribution, having in mind that we are in a cultural mobility forum and we focus a lot on cross-border mobility, I wanted to check with you these two ideas and see if the cultural impact that we talk about, but also this mobility justice, are somehow revisited because of the environmental conversation.
Well, absolutely, because everything intersects, right? Yeah. We have to take on an intersectional lens, but also I don't know if I'm going to answer your questions. I'm going to say a bunch of things that are going through my head right now.
Yeah.
The one is, you know, with my, what's the word, my nervousness when I hear these conversations that want to develop matrices and forms of measuring and evaluating is that I get triggered because even in the funding space, you know, there's a lot of that happens. It becomes its own kind of labor trying to articulate the impact of what you do. Because when you were giving your example, I was like, but that's stuff that happens all the time here. And so the burden of proof is that I must, as an African practitioner, find the words to make what I do instinctively as a way of coexisting in an environment sound like it meets a matrix that was designed by somebody who does not understand my context. So this labor becomes mine. And of course there'll be things about my particular reality, and I've said this already, that will be lost in this matrix. And of course I then get nervous about how it is that it's going to perpetuate my exclusion, my inability to meet these standards. And also another thought that's going through my head is how counterintuitive it becomes to, while purporting to save one thing, I'm being sacrificed at the altar in order for this other thing to exist. So in terms of the amount of emotional labor that goes into this performance, and then also, yeah, so to answer your question, I think if we understood that all these struggles somehow and these wins and these opportunities somehow intersect, then we move away from this tendency to want to silo actions and develop, you know, yeah.
I like the expression, just silo action.
Yeah.
I think it's very relevant, the idea of, or to mention again, the intersection between this particular topic of environmental sustainability with many others, and how somehow the narrative or the narrative of environmental sustainability is also sometimes approached as a top-down thing, or another power relation. Who is who's this injunction to talk about environmental sustainability comes from. The same for you, Selim, in terms of both the cultural impact and the mobility justice that are connected. How do you think around these terms?
Yeah, I think we have a real link between cultural impact and mobility. For example, with Early Festival, we have a real cultural impact because we impact people who don't have access to performance, to cultural performance. So we have an impact, but this impact is also linked to cultural mobility, to the mobility, because these people, if they don't have access to culture in their region, because they don't have access to mobility in their country, because you don't have, maybe it's complicated, or it's expensive to move from the south of Tunisia to the north, and it's also don't have access to move from Tunisia to another country because of the elephant we speak about, and all this economic issue, etc. So I think the cultural impact and the mobility have, of course, a link, and with the cultural impact we make in our country and our context, we can move forward this mobility. I think we can, if we can, find solution in local to have this cultural impact and to have a big impact with the mobility. I think the mobility issue is, it's decrease the cultural impact, can decrease the cultural impact. When we can invite, for example, performers from South Africa, from Japan, etc., we have a negative cultural impact due to this mobility and to this mobility issue. When artists from Tunisia can move to Europe because of visa, etc., they have a negative cultural impact from them due to the mobility access. So I think the link is still present between these two, negative and positive, between the cultural impact and the mobility.
It is also interesting, in the article that you wrote for this yearbook, you were also pointing out very honestly the danger of bringing in the conversation the green mobility aspect when many of the global south players don't access mobility at all. And these resonated very much with Aj Bencheladi words also from the A la carte project. They made a report very recently. And he was saying that many of the Arab world cultural players are concerned that their carbon footprint will be used as an excuse to put some hindrances on their already challenged international mobility. And these words are words that we hear very often when trying to unpack the reality of what is green mobility, what is a slower mobility, what is having the opportunity to change the way we access creation means, production means, and touring or presenting opportunities for artists from the global south. When you were talking about the idea of justice just now, for me it resonates a lot with the notion of solidarity that you also developed in your text, and how we, and again let's define this we should be more active and try to walk towards a more solidarity-based ecosystem. Could you develop a little bit this idea for me?
I'm going to try. And I like this last bit that you said, it's a walk towards, it's not a destination, and it's not linear. It's a walk. And so, and it's a survival instinct from everyone concerned, the humans, the environment, the everything. So it's not binary, it's not one thing or the other. It can be a lot of things all at once, which is why the conversation has to be ongoing. It has to be what what we mean by this has to be co-created, and everybody has to be in the room, and we have to be willing to shift. So we're not trying to work towards a document that is static and solid, that lives somewhere, that we all have to tick boxes in order to be able to. It requires us to be a lot more iterative and proactive, and to maybe go back to this idea of, and so in those instances where we are working on a particular project or intervention, wherever you sit, where you have decision-making powers, how are you kind of holding yourself accountable as an act of solidarity to those who sit in a more disadvantaged position than you do, to develop something that considers the ways in which you can be enacting acts of a kind of solidarity and justice to kind of redress imbalances that we're all aware of. I write about this a little bit in the text around the fact that we need to consider that wherever we are now is a consequence of a world order that is patriarchal, neoliberal, white supremacist, that is capitalist. And so when we begin to talk about justice and redress, how do we take this into consideration when we're designing? And how do we invite voices into rooms that are able to give us perspectives that are not available to us, so that we can walk towards this idea of a just and yeah.
And in your text, in relation to these, to reminding the realities of different structures, different histories also in cultural policy making, but also in terms of opportunities to create and to work and to have a cultural impact. You were reminding us that there are dependencies or interdependencies, and in the way you approach the environmental sustainability issue, we felt that you were really developing or advocating for, let's not put environmental sustainability as the priority, in a way, and try to consider all these other elements. And in particular, let's not, jeter le bébé avec l'eau du bain. I don't know how to say that in English. Huh? To throw the baby with the water. Sounds weird. Yes, it is.
Yeah, of course, because I don't know how I can say that, but I think like the green mobility and the sustainability issue is also a big wide problem, an European problem. I think here we have, it's a problem to all of us, but I think we don't, maybe we don't have this priority on this first problem, because for us, when we hear that in Europe they don't want to invite foreign company because we have a carbon impact, etc. And when some choreographers say we don't take the plane to perform out of a country, I say yes, it's wonderful, it's a big idea, it's amazing, but it's impossible for me. Because here we have maybe, if I take the dance field, we have 5 or 6 festivals by a year in all the countries. So if I want to work with my art, and if I want to live with my art, I have to travel. I have to perform outside Tunisia. And so okay, it's important to have a green mobility, but to dance in South Africa, I can't take the train. And to dance in my country, in Tunis, I can't take the train. So I have some time to have a carbon impact. So that's why I say the context is really important to make, I think. And we can make, I don't know if we can have a priority of problem, but I think it's a global problem. It's an ecological problem, of course, but also economic problem for us. It's liberty to create also, it's an issue. Possibility to create is an issue. So for us, when we are invited by a foreign festival, we are really happy. And we don't say, no, we have to take a 2-hour plane. We are just happy to work outside, to can get money and to work with people here.
I understand.
And also, if you consider what you're saying, Selim, it's to then say, as an act of solidarity, if you recognize that for most African artists, in order to sustain themselves, they need a combination of all these things, including international travel. So then the question to our colleagues in the global north who have the power to invite us to come and kind of work in your context, in the ways in which you procure work from Africa, how are you thinking about our sustainability as your colleagues? So what are those conversations, the ways in which, because obviously the global north has an appetite for art and work and cultural artists and cultural workers from the global south, but how do we begin to have different conversations around how to interact with African artists in ways that are sustainable, both for their practice, for their livelihoods, and for the environments that they inhabit. And so this definition of what an environment is, it begins to be a thing that needs to be understood to be broader than what I think we are understanding it as now, and to make room for contestation on what that environment, because I, as an African artist, I absolutely am part of the environment that makes up the ecosystem of this sector, before we even go to the extent of kind of having these other interesting ideas of how we understand the environment. And so if I am part of that environment and I form part of the ecosystem, how does the ecosystem make sure that it does not eat me up alive, you know?
I agree also. I mean, what I feel is when Selim talks about this, let's say, economical impact or ties that could link global south and global north, I also feel that you also describe an appetite, which I would say many cultural players in the global north have and want to nourish these relations for artistic purposes and not just because of the
consuming.
Because we love the arts, so we want to continue to access and support diversity of artistic expression. In this conversation.
So let that be reflected in the touring circuits, in the remuneration, in the way that these arrangements are, in the way that these arrangements begin to look like. That, while there's so I like the distinction between wanting to nourish as opposed to wanting to consume. I want a bunch of Africans to come and sing Ipindombi. I'll bring them for 2 weeks and then they go back. But how do you think about,
It's interesting that already we see some interesting ideas, I would say, and even concrete ideas we could play with all together. We all together could play with. The idea of continuing to have international relations and not to cut these relations is one thing. The second thing is to acknowledge the codependencies or interdependencies and the idea that we want to continue to have these cross-border mobility no matter what sometimes the ecological impact. And we collectively need to navigate how to balance these aspects, probably, finding carbon footprint to reduce elsewhere, maybe not, we'll see. What also is interesting and important is you mentioned the word freedom, which also resonates a lot with the work that On the Move has been doing for quite some time. The freedom of artistic expression and the idea that by traveling outside of one's own context, you access not only means, but also an environment that is supportive towards an actual exercise of your artistic freedom. How does that also resonate with you?
To be freedom, you mean?
Yeah, artistic freedom.
I think artistic freedom is on the of the performance we create, of course, but artistic freedom is also linked to mobility. It's where we can perform and how we can perform and which subject we can involve and can take. Sometimes some professionals say that it's we program us as Tunisian artists, as African artists, and as an Arab artist, and I always say we are just artists in the beginning, and if we want to speak about green mobility, we can, and if we want to speak about freedom society or religion, we can also. So I think we don't have to have a power of art and have pressure on the artist to say you are from each country and you have to speak about each subject. I think it's important to have this freedom activity and to have freedom to say what we want to say, on the stage. Freedom is also linked to mobility because as an artist, but also as a public, when we invite performance, I think we have we have to have freedom to watch different performance from different country. For me, it's a right as a citizen to watch different performance from different country, but it's not always possible because of mobility. This year, for example, in the Festival of Carthage Dance in June, we'll invite people from 8 or 9 countries around the world. And it's not really easy, like this forum, to work with visa and work with airplane and artists to say how we can link between visa, freedom, etc. But in final, it's impact the audience because they have the right to watch performs from Togo, from Morocco, from Algeria, and I think culture makes this freedom right.
Thank you for this. I have a last question. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, even though my thoughts are unformed, but I do feel like I need to say this. So this thing of artistic freedom and particularly artists who come from states where there's more repression for various reasons, from race to gender to radical ideas. So this idea of movement does mean that when you move locations and you're somewhere else, you are able to find space for expression of your particular ideas and work. So there's that, and it's important. We've seen artists seeking asylum in different countries because they can't exist in countries where they're from. So there's that value. Then there's this one that I'm still formulating. If it comes to me, there's this, but then also that also leaves these artists vulnerable to being instrumentalized by countries, organizations, organs that want to posture this idea of how radical they are. So they become the enablers of these artists who are unable to exist in their context. To some extent, there's another environmental threat because those kinds of things can be done in a manner that can be quite reckless, that can cause harm in the long run. So there's that conversation that we need to have and hold each other accountable. Because yes, I can, so that's another idea. The third thing I want to say on that is that okay, I stop here. If there's something else that I'm thinking about regarding this movement and this freedom and who enables what and who funds what and what this freedom means and in what ways this freedom can be problematic, but also because if you remember, like usually, for example, with the cultural agencies, by that I mean the alliances and the Gutes and the whatevers, they exist in these countries and they become that corner of the world where these artists can do this thing, right? But at the same time, the reason why the tensions exist in some of these contexts, they are fueled by historical relationship with these particular countries that are responsible for the kinds of liberties that exist and don't exist in these countries. So it becomes a perverted little dance, no? Yeah, it's a strange one.
Okay. I'm going to open the floor so all of you in the room, but also all the people watching online can comment, share their thoughts, but also ask questions to our speakers. We have mics here that can be circulated in the room. We would ask you to wait for having the mic here so we make sure that everybody watching online can actually hear you. Maybe a last question from me before we, or do you want already, do we have already people? Yes, Marianne? Yes, of course, yes.
I know I always raise my hand first.
Please.
You can ignore me if you want. Thank you to all of the speakers, including the work that Yohann is doing to link the comments. I'm impressed with your eloquence. It's beautiful to listen to you, so thank you, first of all. Secondly, I just read a very, very long article. I think it came from a German media, but I read it in Italian, and it was about whether or not it's reasonable to expect that the airline industry will become green, of course, which we all dream of. This is our ideal, right? But it put into context, and sometimes I think the cultural sector doesn't put into context something that the two of you have been talking about, or it feels to me, which is that the ecological harm of airlines is tiny in relationship with the construction industry, and particularly the making of cement, for example. And the authors of this very long article, very analytical, also talked about the difference of traveling because of work and traveling because of luxury. And I think sometimes we make ourselves feel guilty in the art sector because we look at touring as a major problem. And so I was very moved by the fact that you were talking about sustainability as a holistic issue to look at, and how to make perhaps just say programmers and curators in the global north realize the mixed economy that some people have to work under and the importance of this touring. So I would love to have more conversations about that. The other, so it's not really a question, it's a request to speak more about how that can happen. I suppose that's what this conference is all about. And the second is to do with, I would love it, first of all, Icona, I love the way you think and then you speak. You're very eloquent and you obviously weigh your words carefully, but I would love you to extrapolate a little bit on the last point that you made, because I think I know exactly what you're talking about, and it would be wonderful if you could give examples about this perverse effect of perhaps certain countries exploiting the rhetoric of artistic freedom when in fact, looking back in history, they probably contributed to some of the issues that make it hard to have that freedom. Thank you.
She said it. But she said it. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you for your comment, Marianne.
Yeah.
And I'm just gonna continue to, I don't see very well, so you really need to raise your hand, and I'm sure somebody will come. Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you for the three of you. I have two ideas that I want to share with you. The first one is about the power of art and the responsibility of the artists. I now think that perhaps that we ask too much from us. The gender issues, and now every issue is the responsibility of the artist and the arts. Of course, we can participate to make a change, but we can say that now we don't have budgets, and we don't have the willpower. Capital have, and government have, and they don't do their job. So they ask us to do it for them. So this is the first thought. And now, this is the first one. The second one is about you, Yohann, you were talking about the we. What does it mean that we, from the big north and the big south, the big north, decide that there is today a big issue, which is environment. But this is an issue because we feel it every day. We have less water, for example, here or in Morocco, etc. But in the same time, does it mean that if the concern of the North, that now we have to act and take in that point important, perhaps that if we share our what we know to do and to deal with the crisis, because we have a lot to teach the North. You were talking about very intuitive ways of our artists, our ancestors, and that way perhaps that we can create a we, and with justice from sharing ideas and thoughts, and not only the North saying us that now it's an emergency and you have to act with that emergency. I don't know if I'm enough clear with that 2 points. Voilà.
You are. Do you want to comment on this?
We are aligned with this, yeah. And we are okay when we say that we have a big responsibility, and we cannot take all this responsibility as an artist. And it's interesting to say, who are the we, this famous we, who are the we, and how we can work on it.
I mean, your remark really makes me go back to Yaman's words, Yaman al-Zubaydi, who was last year invited to the Cultural Mobility Forum to talk about diversity, inclusion, and he was really relaxed, and he's a diversity expert. And he was very relaxed, and he was really saying, we are a laboratory, so let's just be a laboratory. We try, maybe we fail, maybe we succeed, maybe we inspire others, but our very small power is actually to be this particular laboratory. And I like very much the idea that we take a share, but we position, we see ourselves for who we are and what we are and the place we have in the big picture. So thank you for your word, Maria. Do we have other comments or questions? Yes.
Yeah. First, thank you for opening this kind of panel for us. So I have a few points here. The first one is, I'm just quoting from the idea about the lady was talking about having this type of support from outside, inside the countries. So in this point, especially for the countries who doesn't or have kind of very poor support from the local, whomever, for the cultural and artistic movements. First, we can kind of don't understand exactly the strategy that they are trying to implement inside these type of countries. And also, I'm sorry to say that, but they have kind of a very lack of understanding the local context. So they have their kind ideas and trying to implement that ideas which were implemented in another continent and that specific part of the world which has a very different type of culture and mentality and these type of things. Not all the way, but I mean, we struggle to kind of try to kind of change that way inside our countries. I'm talking about my own experience, at least. And the other part that the countries that I mean the lady that we're talking about, we are not kind of the artists or the artistic field is not kind of very responsible for the whole thing. It's kind of a whole chain. So there's supposed to be kind of a parallel work between the artistic and the real actual movements on the ground that can, I mean, do the real work for the climate change, for the carbon whatever, for every single other movement. So here, I mean, it's kind of very huge things in my mind right now, but the first point is one of my main struggles since like 10 years for now, the understanding of the local context from the support coming from the outside and also the strategies. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how we can share our local context. And for me, it's linked with a project we lead in Archipel. And the idea was to, okay, we want to create a project of artistic mobility from Tunisia, Nantes in France, and Quebec in Canada. So how we can create together to create this kind of mobility, and how we can share our context. So one of the solutions we find, we create our we, and our we was artist and cultural manager and director of institution. And we work all together on how we can move from Tunisia to Quebec to Nantes together. And when we speak about solution, it's always the case. We have just problem solution. So I think so to have one of the solution to know more the context. I invited the people from Quebec and from Nantes to Tunisia for a week, and I said we have to be on our country and our context to understand more what we live here. And we did the same with the Tunisian artist and with Tunisian manager, cultural manager, to move to Quebec and to move to Nantes. And after this free time of meeting, we can have once a big meeting to say, okay, now when we know the reality of each one of us and our budget and our difficulties, how we can think together to find a solution, to find a way of working together. And we find a little solution with this 30 member to say, okay, I don't have enough money to invite an artist, but if you work all together, maybe you can invite it for a free week. He can perform in my festival. He can have a residency in El Hamra. He can maybe work on a workshop in the Teatro, etc. So I think to share our local context and to follow a strategy, we have to share it, and the best way to share something is to live it. That's why I don't really like the virtual connection, etc., because it's just virtual. And I think when we come in Tunisia and we say the context, and when we come to a different country, we also show a context. And I think it's really important to have this kind of time to share concretely how we can work and how we can create together.
So it's very important for me to say right now that we absolutely want the money from the global north. We do, we need it, we deserve it, and if you trace it back, you'll find that it came from here in the first place. So let this not be understood to mean that because we are critical of some of the methods and the ways in which certain organs tend to operate here, it means that we do not want the money. What we are calling for is a less extractive, a less exploitative, a less paternalistic relationship towards something else, which is slightly more collaborative, so that something else can emerge as an act of solidarity and justice.
It's all, connecting to your comments, it's all about changing the matrix, or reviewing the matrix heavily, and making sure that other components come in the picture when devising projects, programs, etc., are factored in.
And I know that I'm being pedantic about maybe rejecting the word metrics, because it's something a lot more eco-systematic and natural and than metrics. It's just my own, because when you say metrics, I just see those forms. I'm like, hey.
Do we have other comments and questions? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. Maybe just I wanted to add one experience related to an exhibition and a program that I was organizing last year. It was in the format of biennial, and it was related to digital technology and art around it. But actually what was important, because it was after pandemia, so there was like many questions about, like green digital art and like hard copies, etc. And what we did is that we asked one of the Polish NGOs to revise and measure actually the real carbon footprint of everything related to the event. So travels, a piece of arts that were coming, website, printed materials, etc. And it was really interesting because it gave us like a real knowledge how this footprint, relates to different levels of events that or activities we organize. And it was very interesting. For example, in terms of traveling, we had around 20 guests coming from mostly from Europe, but then one guest coming from Australia. And this ticket from Australia actually left the bigger footprints than most of the rest of the guests. So sometimes it's, for me, and then we checked like the website, and for example, it was interesting that we decided to have like many, like the most of the materials printed on the spot. But then we realized that actually the website and all PDFs are also so big carbon footprint that sometimes maybe it's even better to print like a small amount or something like really tiny, but to do it also in a kind of sustainable way. So I'm just giving this comment because I think that sometimes we need like a real knowledge, and maybe like in this case we ask the NGO that is really revising all and is giving very professional measurements also for many cultural institutions right now, because sometimes we just don't have like this real data where we are. Thank you.
Can I just say something? So one of the things that I was hoping for when I get here is that there'd be hard copies of the yearbook, which I don't see. And then I thought to myself, oh my God, environmental sustainability, which means that I can't take a copy to my dad to read, who doesn't have internet. So it means that I can't take a copy to my aunt to read and be proud. It means that this information is not reaching certain people. And I appreciate the level of detail that you guys engage in understanding this piece. And it's important work, and I'm sure it's going to be useful. But I also then recognize, oh my God, this is an entire industry of measuring the measurement of the measurement. And there are people who stand to benefit from this extra kind of, this industry that is emerging. And there are people who don't have the luxury of of doing things like that simply because they are surviving. And so, and I say this to not criticize what you have to say, just to say a lot of things can be true at once, and I think I'll keep saying, the end, many things can be true at the same time, is my conclusion to all of this. Not that I'm trying to close the conversation. Yes, MVG.
Mike, yes, please.
So I understand the concern about climate change and its threat to human sustainability and of the earth. But I just wondered, with the Ukraine war, if there is a movement of the arts sector within Europe in particular around nuclear disarmament, given that nuclear war poses a lot more of an immediate threat to human existence and to the sustainability of the earth.
At large.
Is it a question for me?
Well, I'll tell you.
Is it beyond the pay grade? No. But I think, obviously, the context of the question is that we are now in the global south talking about how climate change impacts on, our future existence as humankind. But right now, there is the very real threat of nuclear war, given what is happening in Ukraine. So I was wondering about the extent to which that war is impacting on the arts sector in Europe in the same way as we've been asked to reflect on climate change and how it impacts on the arts sector in the global south and globally, whether there was a movement in the global north and in Europe in particular that had to do with nuclear disarmament, because that is a threat that we are much more concerned about, certainly in Cape Town, than climate change.
Certainly.
For me, I will not even try to answer this big question, because I don't want to be the white man on stage trying to speak for anybody. I've never encountered in the past months a discourse that would go in that direction, and some form of campaigns from the arts and culture that would go in that direction. But the Ukrainian war had a lot of impact on the way many governments can react very quickly to cross-mobility challenges. And this we could observe. We could see that suddenly the rules are no longer the rules, and the visas are no longer needed, and we can unpack and unlock everything when the political power is willing to do, which is positive in this particular case and the emergency of the war in Ukraine, but also leads to expectations from us, and when I say us, I use this we again, that governments, decision makers are able to hear that we ask for new forms of mobility formats or norms or processes, having in mind this particular case. So it doesn't answer any of your question, but just to, and I think many people comments online or some questions. Yes, Marie, maybe you can convey a couple of comments and questions from online participants.
There is, one general comment that we should not forget as well, because some of us in the room know each other, but there are also people that are following us online. So when it's possible, if people, maybe for the next session also, when people ask questions, just to say a bit who you are and where are you based, because it's important also to know, for instance, that the Biennale that Anna was mentioning is in Poland, for instance. It's also interesting talking about context. So it's also a reminder more to us as organizer. There is also a comment on the role of, it's more a comment, it's not a question, but interesting comment on how all these questions related to environment, freedom, sustainability can be and are in a way addressed collectively by the artists and cultural manager themselves through some international and decentralized organizations, so like international networks such as UNIMA, ACITEJ, which is more on performing arts and young audience, or ITI, like International Theatre Institute. So I guess this is also what a network like On the Move is trying to do. There is one question from Selim, which in a way echo some of the question today, or some of the point that you addressed, but maybe since we are going to the end of this session, this is maybe a time to add an element that you would like to add. So how cultural manager can work to develop the sustainability of the arts and cultural program, and how, in relation to that, how can sustainability be ensured without clear cultural policy? So if one of you want to comment.
Do you want to comment on this? Last.
Just of a point maybe of cultural management manager, how we can make sustainability. I really think that civil society can, and the cultural manager can, have a real impact on this sustainability and his local core impact. I think it's really important to give them the opportunity to make changes in their context, because they know more than anyone the context that we live in, and they have many contact in their context also. So I think cultural manager on the local area, and if we have many local managers in different little area, we can have a biggest impact. But I think it's important to give them the opportunity and the freedom to make it. And this opportunity is related also to the policy, local policy, it's related to the international policy, it's related to the budget impact, etc. So I think we cannot work on top-down strategy. We have to work together in the cultural policy with the local people who know how we can manage their context.
And this is a conversation for the next panel, cultural policy, money, etc. Do you have a last comments you want to?
Maybe to add what Selim had to say. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, what has national local policy done for me lately? And I'm like, nothing. In order to survive, I seem to have to exist somewhere in between all of that, but I don't discount the fact that in some contexts, this is a real thing that yields actual results. And so maybe I'm sitting at a point, I'm like, so it's a multi-pronged approach. Everybody has a role to play. There's the lived experience and the stuff that happens behind the scenes that is not recorded, that is possibly some of the most truest and beautiful examples of these collaborations and what is possible. There's obviously the need to engage the embassies on certain aspects of our work in order for meaningful change to be effected. So I think, it's a multi-pronged approach from all angles, as long as it achieves the desired results. So it's not necessarily a hierarchy. It's all these things.
Like this. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Ukona. Thank you, Selim. It was great to have you here. Thank you for your comments and suggestions and questions. We record everything, so we are taking them on board. I just want to say that this is a panel that is an opening panel, and we could see already many elements that we will have the time to continue to investigate in the other panels of the forum. So this is the end of the first panel. We will have a break, and then we will resume in 30 minutes and start a new panel discussion. Thank you again, both of you. Thank you.